So good evening, I'm Rémi Rabasa. We will start this webinar about the race for type 1 diabetes cure. It's a discussion following the documentary, The Human Trial. We will have this as a first short presentation of a few slides just to set the scene, and then we will go to a discussion, and we will encourage you to ask as many questions as you wish. So all of this, it's part of the series of webinars we're making with the Better Registry. The Better Registry, it's a registry that was built with patients living with type 1 and for patients living with type 1. It's now open to the Canada-wide. It's fully bilingual. And to be frank, we are still looking for as much participant as possible. We are already around 3,000 persons participating to that very interesting adventure. Our guest tonight, we will be four for the discussion. Claude Piché is the co-founder and president of Leucemia. Claude Piché has a long career in pharmaceutical industry, and he is literally the dad of Baqsimi, the nasal glucagon, to rescue severe hypoglycemia. Then we also have Laurence Secours. Laurence is has been living for a long time with type 1 diabetes. She's what we call a patient partner. So she's involved in things like the type 1 Better Registry to say us what is important, to ask us questions. She's also involved in various provincial, like Diabetes Quebec, or national organization like the Framework for Diabetes in Canada. And she's actually working in sociology and extremely interested to reduce stigma. Part of her work can touch to stigma related to diabetes. And finally, we'll have Martin Lafontaine. Martin is working currently as a consultant with pharmaceutical industry to develop pills, for example, or drugs, but also medical device for mainly, but not only for diabetes. And he is also living with type 1 diabetes. So to participate, we will only have one function with it available and functional tonight. It's the Q&A section, not the chat, but really the Q&A section. Please, as soon as you can start to ask your question, and as soon as I'll have finished this very small initial presentation, we will take your question and try to answer it the best we can. So all of this came from that documentary, which was available for the patient participating to the Better Registry, but it's still available in a lot of big platform. And it's actually Lisa Hepner, who actually live with type 1 diabetes and is working in the film industry. They took around numerous years. They followed the first patients, the first two patients actually, who were involved in an attempt to cure diabetes. So now when you want to try to say, okay, I don't want to take my insulin with injection or my insulin with a pump, what would be the other solutions? You can either graft a full pancreas, so you need to have someone dying, and then if the pancreas is available and that you're compatible, then it could be grafted to you. We do this on a quite rare basis. What we do more often, even though it's a rare procedure, we take the cells of that pancreas from someone, from a dead body, and we graft only the cell that produce insulin, the so-called beta cells, to produce insulin. And what this documentary is about, it's about the development of a new option that don't need anyone dying and to get his pancreas to get back either all the pancreas or only those cells, but it's to develop in the lab, literally like in a factory, from specific cells, the cells that produce insulin that can now be grafted to someone without having to get them from someone dying. So they really follow the two first patients, and they very elegantly, in my opinion, show how hard is that research for the patient, for the company, how hard is it to to try to make the program. A few patients that have been done, and we discussed this with the Francophone part of that webinar a few minutes ago. Some of them are now completely free of insulin with an updated version of what is in the trial. So to set the scene, any question is a good question, but we want to know your importance and how do you feel about the importance of clinical trials? If you've seen the documentary, why is research costing so much? And we had a lot of questions in the Francophone part of that webinar about why is the medications costing so much? What about the promise of stem cells? So those new cells that in the lab, in a factory, you can transform them in whatever kind of cell you are able to. And now we're able to have some of them producing insulin and acting like a normal beta cell. How can we accelerate research? How can the things like the registry like we have can connect, for example, people interested in research with the research teams for whatever is interesting for this or that patient? And also we encourage you to ask as many questions about in between, waiting for that cure that might come at some point. What are the needs? What are the needs for you to improve your quality of life? What are the needs to improve access to medications? Do you believe that psychological mental health support is really important and an unmet need? What about stigma? What about prevention of type 1 diabetes? So after that short presentation, we would encourage you to ask questions, and we will try as much as possible to discuss those questions, distributing them between our two industry specialists and two persons living with type 1. And as a physician, I will try to answer around this. So what about the cure? The first question is, one company is announcing the cure for 27. What about this? And as we discussed this with prior to getting live, is the cure for in 5 years? I remember that in 2000 the cure was in 5 years. So when do some of you believe that the cure will come? Do you have Martin? Maybe your nonverbal say that you might have.
I'm a bit biased, and maybe I shouldn't, but I was diagnosed in 1987, and I do remember back then, the cure was to come in 5 years, and I still waiting. I do remember actually when I got my first job, and they told me you're going to start with 3 weeks vacation, you're going to get your 4th week in 5 years. I said I want that by writing, because I still remember all this, this 5 year from now. And so having said that, I think the last 35 years of me living with diabetes, I've seen a lot of trials in terms of try to get to know more about what's going on. And I think we're coming to a stage now that the different pieces of the puzzle are coming together, which makes me very confident that is it going to be 10, 15, 20? I'm not going to say a number, but I'm very confident that all the work that is being happening right now is going to, create a solution at some point. So my reaction to when will the cure happen is more about what can we do today and tomorrow to better live with this condition with the tools that we have, which are way better today than what we had like 30 years ago. So that's my initial reaction. Yeah. So.
Yes, I personally. Sorry, go ahead.
I would just add, Rémi, Martin, that I think we're going to see cure will be really segmented. We're going to see people who respond really well to certain therapy, and are cured.
Yeah.
And others are not, because this is a disease that has many components. It's not like we have one genetic defect we must address. We have multiple things that we must address at the same time. So I think we're going to see a progressive, it'll progress over time. We're going to see some patients respond really well to certain therapies and will be cured. And others, it's going to take more time. That's how I see it. And it's not 5 years, it's not 10 years, maybe it's 15. I'm not sure.
And
we have a ways to go.
I fully agree. And some might say, because this might help me to cure, but there might be some side effects. I don't want to go there, and I want to stay with my current insulin therapy and so on. So it's going to become extremely, it's a word that I love, but at the same time, it's a word we use when we don't know exactly where it's going. It's to be individualized. It's going to be every person taking different things and so on. So I believe we believe we could do this in the next 10 years. I hope this will not come back to me in 11 years, not showing this. And I fully acknowledge this. I was a young physician in France when the first closed loop was done in Europe. It was extremely impressive for me. At that time, it was thought that the insulin pump should be in the body, literally surgically introduced in the body of the patient, that the glucose sensor was supposed to be inside a big vessel and so on. And everyone was thinking that this was going to solve diabetes within a few years. Actually, this was in December 1999. I remember just before Christmas, we did this the first time. And then there was that big kind of, it was going nowhere. It was not working. There was a lot of issues. And now we have all those so-called artificial pancreas, we should say automated insulin, basal insulin delivery, that are there. It took roughly 20 years to be available with a lot of question marks and things like that. It's not absolutely perfect. So I believe we are there. The technology is available for this. And we had this question in the webinar in French we just had. So the step we believe now is with stem cells, the current stem cells that are in clinical trial, and by the way, in clinical trial in Montreal with RCM and McGill working together to do this, they still need anti-rejection therapies. And anti-rejection therapies are essential, but they have some side effect. Immunosuppression, for example, you probably heard during the COVID pandemic how people with immunosuppression were at higher risk of doing severe form of COVID. The step after that is to be able to reduce or even don't use at all this anti-rejection therapy. And there are two big ways that are seen to do this. And sometimes, you know, I'm speaking today two big ways, maybe a third one will emerge in a few weeks. One is to put those islet cells that produce insulin into a little pouch that would prevent the immune cells from reaction to get into it, still living freely the glucose and insulin to get in and out. And it's not easy because insulin is a big molecule. So when you need a big hole to have insulin getting out. Usually a little white blood cell is able to get in, but there are some tricks to do this, or to have stem cells directly from the own body of the patients that we would be able to differentiate in a way that they would not be recognized to be different from the body, and then you would not need immunosuppression. It's definitely going to be more critical to that, because when you take a stem cell and you transform it into a beta cell, you have slight modifications that makes the cell not exactly as the one of Martin or Laurence at the beginning, but we know the route for this, and it seems possible. A second question which came here is, meanwhile, so we have all those new insulin. What about the glucose responsive insulin? So the insulin that are able to be kept under the skin when the glucose is low, and on the contrary, when there is a high glucose release. So Claude or Martin, are you aware about those kind of things?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of interest in there. Merck spent a pile of money about 10 years ago buying a glucose responsive insulin. They took it to phase 1. The data were not encouraging enough. They killed the program. Having said that, Novo and Lilly, at a minimum, are both working on glucose responsive insulins. In fact, Lilly bought, what's the name of the company? Starts with a P. Anyway, they bought a company last year with a glucose responsive insulin. Novo did a phase 1 study in glucose responsive insulins. There's a company in Ohio called Axton Bio that's working on a glucose responsive insulin. There's at least 3 or 4 companies working in this field, but it's early stage. It's all phase 1 or before.
Yes,
so we are a long way from clinical proof of concept.
So the phase 1 is it works in animals, at least for huge glucose variations, and probably not the one that the patient would wish in their real life. And phase 1 is the first time a medical product is tested in humans. Usually it is tested in non-diabetic patients, for example, at that time. And then phase 2 is to try to find a good dose and establish again the safety in a patient that have the disease. So let's take here the example as type 1 diabetes. And then phase 3 is all the studies that Health Canada in Canada or the FDA in the US would require prior a company could file to get the authorization to get into the market.
We're a long ways from there.
So, and by the meantime, just to add, like another way to make insulin responsive today is to do it mechanically through medical device. So it's not a glucose responsive insulin. It's a way to make insulin responsive. And with automation today, as we know, insulin pump, continuous sensors talking to each other, it allows insulin to be a bit smarter, but mechanically, not through these types of engineering. So
and not chemically.
Yes, exactly. And not everyone need a pump and a glucose sensor and those artificial pancreas, but it is definitely for those ones who can afford it and want it and need it. It's the best of 2 worlds. It's less hypo, less hypo, so less malaise and so on. It's less hyper. So in theory, it hasn't been proven yet. It's probably less risk to the eye, the kidney, and the nerves. It's also automation, so it's less burden. It's a new burden. There are new issues when the sensor doesn't work or when there is an issue with the catheter and so on. But all the patients I know that have switched to this or adopted it tell us that it's a new burden, it's a new learning curve, but it's a less heavy burden on the back of the patients around this. Claude and Martin, we had a lot of questions in the Francophone about how does it cost so much to develop a medication? What is, and actually the documentary showed this very elegantly, how much is the race for the money. We see them going all around the world in the documentary. If I remember well, they are going in Tokyo and in the Middle East. I don't remember if it's Dubai or Riyadh, but it's somewhere in those countries really looking for money. How costly is it to develop a medication? Why is it so costly to develop a medication?
So I'll touch on that to start with. At least on the purely regulatory front, we have incredible hurdles to meet from a safety perspective. So before you even dose a first patient, if you have a new molecule, you have to show safety. It could cost you $3 or $4 million in order to even conduct a single 1-dose study. And then when you go beyond that, in diabetes, we want those people for weeks, months, years. So you have to show safety for your molecule at multiples of the dose for weeks, months, years. These kinds of studies where you're running them in rats and dogs, for example, cost millions and millions of dollars. So just to run the studies that allow you to even try your medication in people cost millions and millions. So there's a big burden in terms of the regulatory requirements, and I can appreciate the regulatory requirements because our regulators want to make sure our people are safe. So people who participate in a study, are they being well protected? That's the most important question here. We want to try a new medication in people. Are we sure, or as sure as we can be, that it's safe? So it just increases the cost of getting to that point to try the compound in people. And then once you get into clinical studies, well, then you have small studies, phase 1, a little bit larger studies, phase 2. But all these studies, the cost just goes up and up and up. And then when we get into diabetes, not so much in type 1, but for sure in type 2, you have to show not just a glycemic control, but a cardiovascular benefit. And maybe that will come one day to type 1 as well. But these things require huge clinical studies. So there's tremendous risk in bringing a new compound into a clinical program, tremendous cost. And so these things all add up, and that's what makes that it's so expensive to develop a drug.
But it was something that was discussed in the Francophone part, Martin. It's not free for all. A company cannot ask for, I mean, it's expensive. We all acknowledge this, but there are rules in Canada. A company cannot say, there is kind of a real evaluation of how much is it. Can you comment on this, Martin?
Yes. So then Claude talked about the cost of developing the drug. For a company, there's been investors coming, right, to invest their money. We're looking for return on investment. The company also needs to amortize this successful program, if they're successful, with the 10 other ones that have failed. So it just puts even more pressure on creating an ROI. And then this has to be put into an equation for pricing. A big difference in the healthcare system here in Canada versus the US, for example, is that we're not living here in a free pricing environment in Canada, which is good. So this is regulated by government body in terms of what a company can charge for this drug. And there's a lot of tools they have to create to show the clinical benefits, the health economics, and so on, so on. And then there's a body giving recommendations to the provinces. And then it's up to the provinces to say, okay, you decide if you want to reimburse A, B, C, D, and E. In the US, it's very different. A company can charge whatever they want. It is now regulated, but we don't live in such an environment. And that's a good thing here in Canada, where it is controlled pricing for pharmaceuticals and medical device.
Okay, there is a question, if I understand well, which is alluding to the Edmonton Protocol, which is actually, it's Edmonton Protocol. It's the phase where what they have really transformed is the ability to isolate from someone, a dead body, the pancreas, isolate the islets, and inject them into a person with type 1 that need it, for example, because he is making, for example, recurrent severe hypoglycemia, with a far less toxic anti-rejection medications. This has been a tremendous improvement. It's definitely the center who changed it. Actually, we call it the Edmonton Protocol, because one problem among the numerous problems related to the anti-rejection therapy is that they can actually promote diabetes by themselves. If you, for example, you have a kidney graft or something which have nothing to do with diabetes, you can eventually develop diabetes because of the anti-rejection therapy. So what they did in the Edmonton Protocol is to tremendously reduce the toxicity of those anti-rejection medications for the beta cell that you were giving. So it's a bit like if you would have a heart graft and the anti-rejection medication you would be bad for your heart. This is what was happening for type 1 diabetes prior to that extraordinary progress with the Edmonton Protocol and so on. So it's actually, yes, really a big improvement that happened in between. Laurence, what about the fact that, what would you say as a patient that would be your awaited need as a patient in terms of in between awaiting this? Let's imagine that you don't want to pump. What is really absolutely necessary for you on a day-to-day basis, and what would you await in a short-term few years to help treatment for patients?
I think, and this is especially for Canada, and I think it's even urgent for Quebec for Francophone, but also for the Anglophone part, is all the moral and the psychological support that is absolutely lacking in Canada, that you see a little bit more in United States because of the cost of the insulin create this movement, Insulin for All. And you know, in the documentary, at some point she said, it become a joke in the community that 5 years from now, blah, blah, blah. And I really bug on the word community, because I don't see this community in Quebec, maybe a little bit in Alberta and a little bit in BC, but I don't. I think this is a main focus that we need to address like as soon as possible in between things of like the pump or the stem cells.
But you're right, Laurence, things are changing. So for example, some patients decided to develop their own artificial pancreas outside of the commercial product. So it's extremely interesting to see some patient telling either we don't want to wait or we need that product with more flexibility and beyond the authorization of Health Canada. So I don't want to promote this. I'm one of the physicians accepting to see those patients with those product that they develop, let's say we call it do-it-yourself or homemade artificial pancreas. And it's, but it's extremely interesting to see that the patients want to develop their own thing, as you alluded, Laurence, because insulin was so expensive. Up to recently, there has been an incredible decrease of price of insulin after a lot of complaints of the patient and so on. In the US, it's still more expensive than in Canada, but it's less expensive than it used to be. So the patient are changing their point of view. They are writing, they are advocates, a lot of advocacy. And yes, I believe we need communities of patients just with the patient and some like better where we have that kind of interaction with the patients and to learn and to know about this and so on. So I really, please ask us some questions, or I will, if you don't, I will take some questions from the Francophone thing that we had in just before this one. So don't hesitate to ask us questions. If you've seen in the documentary, if some part of it have been not liked by you. So to relate to what Laurence just said, one of our big faults seeing the documentary is how they underestimated the need for psychological support for those incredibly brave patients that actually went into the trials and how hard it was for them at some point. So maybe we're going to reflect this, but I want to reassure you, it's not said at the end of the documentary, and I would have wished that there would be a little written thing, but the two patients that you see there, it was a failure in terms of curing their diabetes, and you can see how much it was hard psychologically for them at some point, but two of them are getting very well. With Claude and Martin, we were lucky enough to meet patient number one, the lady in the documentary, just before Christmas in Montreal, and she's getting extremely well. But in the documentary, you can see her and the patient number two, the gentleman at the end of the documentary, it's obvious that he is not going well, but now he is going better. And again, to relate to what Laurence was telling, the need of psychological support for day-to-day, but also in research. So how inspiring was this to see how those patients went to test that cure and so on? Claude, you're muted. You're muted even after.
I was just going to say, Rémi, like when I saw the film, I was so shaken, like literally shaken, by the lack of psychological support for the study participants. I've run clinical trials, but none of the studies I've ever run had this kind of a psychological aspect where people were thinking, I might have a chance at a cure. No, it was a treatment, or it was a pharmacokinetic study, like a simple study. But this kind of study, it just told me so much how much these people need psychological support, and that wasn't part of the study. Maybe it's a lesson learned. That's what it is. It's a lesson learned on future kind of studies where you've got a potential cure for diabetes, for arthritis, for any kind of chronic disease. Boy, these people need, like they are committing their heart and soul to this protocol, but somebody needs to support them. Yes, and that was a really big thing that came out of the film for me. Is how these people really need more support.
And actually, as patient number one, she told me a few things that really, for me, were eye-opening. How much she suffered mentally during the protocol at some point, how much she underestimated what was written in the, there is a consent form. You have it's a very long document, very detailed. I know what happened. And she said, actually, my eye just flew over those lines, even if my doctor asked me to read it, and how now she is proud to get through that battle, and how she learned, and how she is feeling incredibly better. But I must say, as a clinical researcher, so I'm involved in trial, even if it's only answering to a questionnaire, giving a blood sample, or getting through. I was involved at some point into the development of one of those artificial pancreas, had some early trials where we had someone following the patient everywhere. Literally, we need to be 6 foot from the patient. So this was meaning at home. I remember at home when one of the kids of the patient, the participant, came back a bit drunk, taken back by the police after a car accident. So you are there. I remember the team controlling the early insulin pump and telling me it's not going well at home. Should we stop the trial or not? So it's it's invasive. It can be very minimal, like a questionnaire, but it can go to that lady number one with all those, extracting the cells. Are they living? Is there signs of toxicity? All those questions around the C-peptide, which is the mark of insulin producing by the body, incredibly like this. Martin, do you have any comments about that in the documentary and how challenging it was for the patients?
Yeah, it was really like shocking, like Claude said, to see and observe. And for me, it comes to really two things. It was a very intensive protocol, right? Very intensive protocol, which people put their heart and soul there, to be part of it. But also the second part, it talks about how high is the hope for this to work. So, and when you put tons of work like they did, maybe the discussion would have been different. If in those cases it would have worked, maybe it would have balanced more discussion. But the hope is so high that when you put all this work, and they had a deception at the end, I think it was very brutal. So I think this is something, as we're looking at future studies moving forward, is to consider is how to support those people psychologically, as you said, Laurence and Claude, because yes, those studies may be very invasive, so a lot to do, but also the hope is so high that hopefully this will work, is that this has to be taken into consideration.
Yes, and sorry, yes, go ahead, Laurence. Sorry, and actually we had a lot of questions in the Francophone part about who would be eligible in theory for an islet graft. And in the future, it might be anyone that want, or that we are able to believe that it's valuable. At this point, the studies, for example, the follow-up of that study, which started in the human trial, and by the way, the last 2 patients that were introduced in the study are now free of insulin. So I don't know if it's a cure. It's something that is already astonishing. But still, now at this point, we are proposing islet graft, the one that I described that are available, like the Edmonton protocol, or the one in that trial, which is about to start in the Montreal area. But there are centers in Toronto, there are centers in Edmonton, I believe, and a lot in the US, are for people that do recurrent severe hypoglycemia. So recurrent comas of hypoglycemia, despite a lot of support in the management in terms of availability of the best insulin and the best technology, the best glucose sensor, and so on. So that's the main indication. In the clinical practice, we have that indication, like in the trial, but we also have the indication of people that, for example, already have another eye graft. So for example, if unfortunately the kidney were damaged so much that you needed already a kidney graft, then having the islet graft can be considered a bit more easily because the anti-rejection therapy is already there. Yes, go ahead, Claude.
No, I'm just following. Yeah.
Okay. So another question we had is about what is the toxicity of anti-rejection therapy? There are some problems with anti-rejection therapies. For example, an example of this is your immune system is less strong, so you can get more infection. Yeah, and for example, at the beginning of the COVID, before all what we learned to live with this, there was a clear, we're really afraid that those people having anti-rejection therapy because of not only islet graft, but also a heart graft or a kidney graft or liver graft could make more severe form of COVID or being more exposed to this. There are a long list of problems related to this, and it's not no toxicity, it's not huge toxicity, but it can be significant toxicity, and there is a lot of adjustment of those medication that needs to be done on a regular basis.
Okay.
So I'm going to check again if there, oh yes, there might have been another questions. Less a comment, less a question than a comment. I am shocked that you're shocked of a lack of psychological support because we don't get support with that type dealing a day to day. So we are shocked that we are unable to install a better support for this. We know that life is not easy, even with type 1 diabetes. We know that this is really important. And what we discussed in the Francophone part is that there are some efforts to have psychologists and psychiatrists that would be trained to see someone with type 1 diabetes with some mental issues, which can be the burden of dealing with the diabetes burnout, we call it. It's just not able to deal with the burden, or a depression, not even related to diabetes, that rather to see those patients with a depression, for example, and by the way, they live with type 1, and I don't exactly know what is type 1, to understand that it's someone living with type 1 that have, for example, depression, and try to have a better training around this to have support when needed. And that's really important. I hope I understood well the sense of your comment.
One thing I want to have, Rémi, on this is I had the chance for, and still now for about 10 years, to be part of a board of a small organization in the US called the Behavioral Psychology Diabetes Institute. And for me, like, it's just that living with type 1 diabetes, what people saw was when I was getting shots, when I was poking my fingers, and this is what they saw. And my answer to people is that no, is because you don't see what's in my head. There's way more, I think, probably to see in terms of the cognitive burden of what is it to live with this condition than just the 4 or 5 poke on the fingers or the injections in a day. And this is not well recognized. This is what this group was trying to achieve and to educate and provide resource. But I still believe today that this is a bit of, as Laurence would say, the poor child of diabetes. The behavioral psychological support to people living with this condition doesn't receive the attention, the recognition it deserves. And this was extreme even in the study when we saw that, hey, this is like a major toll these people are going through. And still, I think this was lacking. So I think I'm 200% aligned with, I think, the comment that was just said, because this needs to be elevated, because there's way more than the needles and the glucose numbers. There's the whole cognitive burden that comes with that condition.
And yes, actually, one of the patients in the documentary say it. I look healthy, but I don't feel healthy, and there is all that burden. And yes, there is a big need. So, for example, Diabète Québec is thinking to provide a training for a mental health specialist to try to get them the basics of diabetes. And I can tell you, it's not only in type 1 diabetes. I'm taking care of a very rare form of diabetes, which is a cystic fibrosis related diabetes. And they really want to be seen as people with cystic fibrosis that have a very specific form of diabetes, and not people living with diabetes, which, by the way, have cystic fibrosis. So it's really, really important. And there's a lot of things that are moving in the good direction. There is a lot of issues about reimbursement, access for mental health in general. But I believe that, for example, to try to wrap up, because I started with this, the type 1 diabetes registry, the better registry that we have now, which was built by patients, really is looking to what we call patient-reported outcomes. There's a lot of question in the registry on how people feel, and I took that example in the previous webinar about a 3.5 hypoglycemia at home with a glass of juice or whatever you would like to treat your hypoglycemia in your hand is not at all the same than being stopped in traffic jam with a 3.5 and unfortunately caught out of guard with no carbohydrate to eat and nothing to do. It's the same value for a researcher like me. It's not at all the same impact on the patient. And I won't detail this here tonight, but I have so much example of hypoglycemia occurring in weird situations, intimate moments, the first interview for a job, a webinar that you are giving, and so on, that it can be extremely annoying. There is no holidays of diabetes, and that's probably some of the reasons for the mental health.
Yeah.
So yes, Laurence, please, and then we will wrap up.
Yes, I really agree about like the shocking part of the documentary, because when I watched it, I wasn't shocked at all. It was like, oh yes, of course, like the reiteration of things I already knew. But there was, for me, a thing that was absolutely shocking, a little thing up top of what I thought. It's at some point we see like the medical team taking champagne and be really reunite together. And a few moments later, you have this patient too, the lady that said that she would give everything to talk to the medical team. And at that point, I was wondering, she does not talk to the medical team. She would give everything to tell them that she suffers. And that's, for me, was the culminant point of the things that don't work in this clinical.
There are rules to separate the research team from the medical team that take care of the patient. And what you were seeing celebrating is the research team, which there are rules to have kind of a firewall in between the two. And yes, it's a bit different. So I will take the last question, and then we will finish. This is about multiple autoimmune disease. That's interesting. We had the same questions on when you have type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease, you can have more, unfortunately, not everyone and not always, but you can have more than one autoimmune disease. You have more frequent thyroid disease. You can have sometimes rheumatoid arthritis. Sorry for the way the francophone is telling this tonight, and so on and so on. So this could lead to multiple graft? I don't believe this will be the case. That's the question we have now. It will have multiple graft. For example, could you have new thyroid cells? I don't believe, because it's quite easy, for example, to treat hypothyroidism if it in that case, or adrenal deficiency. Now, for other autoimmune disease, it might be the case, but I see this really far, far, far on the horizons before we could do multiple graft. What we are doing sometimes already is that if the kidney is damaged and there is a very unstable diabetes with a lot of recurrent hypoglycemia, we can go to the graft both the kidney and the islet graft. Not always at the same time, but it can be done. And in some cases, for example, like cystic fibrosis, they can have the lung and the liver at the same time in the same surgery. This can happen. So sometimes we can graft two things, but really it's a very difficult situation. Yeah. We really want, sorry, yes. Does someone have someone to add? No, sorry, I thought. So we really want to thank you. I want to thank Martin and Claude as people that know the development of those medications, that their job is to accompany some companies to do this. Martin and Laurence as a person living with diabetes, and myself passionate about type 1 diabetes, but I fully acknowledge not living with it. And I truly, frankly think that if I would be living with it, I would be the nightmare for my medical team. I would be the one that they don't want to see on the list. We want
yes, I'm sure.
Yes. We want to thank you for this. We hope you appreciate the documentary as a piece of how hard research is. for the patient first, but also sometimes for the people that are trying to develop this. We don't know when the cure will come, but we are quite confident there is not one route, but that one of the routes that are in front of us is probably the good one to get to it, hopefully in not too long. So thank you very much. Have a nice evening. Merci beaucoup et bonne soirée.
Merci, Rémi. Merci. Merci, Laurence.
Good night, everyone. Merci tout le monde.
Good night.
Bye.